Many years ago, someone said, if God doesn't bring judgment upon America soon, he should apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. Perhaps the person said that intending to be a bit funny, but it's not funny. And certainly God does not need to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah, and he will not. But it does say something about the view of America today and our moral condition. By the way, this statement goes back many, many years. Also, several days ago, the late Jimmy Allen preached a sermon entitled Immorality USA. And he dealt with several different moral issues. Think what he would preach now. Adultery, homosexuality, pornography, and immorality of all kinds are epidemic. Now, these problems are not new. Long ago, God gave a moral code to Israel. Leviticus chapter 18 is where our message comes from this evening. I'm not going to read the whole chapter. You can do that on your own, but I want to read different verses. It begins, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the man who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. I am the Lord. We notice that God speaks of possession. He says, I am the Lord your God. He says it 3 times. We belong to God, and in a sense, God is ours. To draw all these various factors together into one simple thought, we can conclude that the expression, I am the Lord your God, teaches the principle of possession. To put the matter pointedly, God has the right to rule over his people. If God has the right to rule over his people, he has the right to make rules for them. So it is that this statement, I am the Lord your God, precedes the regulations which God gave his people. God gives commands to Israel, and he prefaces those commands with a negative statement. You are not to be like Egypt and Canaan, verse 2. Woods and Rogers say in their commentary, the Israelites were to avoid the sexual license of the country they had left and the one they were to enter. Here they are between countries. Egypt, where they came from, was a land of immorality. They are going to be entering into Canaan, also a land of immorality. They are to drive the Canaanites out. They do not do that completely. That will come back to be a scourge to them. But you're not supposed to be like these other nations. Immorality was rampant, even long, long ago when Leviticus was written. Now there is a positive side. You must obey my laws, verse 4. Commands are given concerning morality. They regulate marriage. They speak against homosexuality, against bestiality, and against child sacrifice. The laws limit who can marry, or who can marry who. And it's very clear from the teachings of this chapter and of the Old Testament and the New Testament that God designed sex to only be in marriage. Now back in 2002, a new book was released with the provocative title, The 50-Mile Rule, Your Guide to Infidelity and Extramarital Etiquette. The author told one interviewer that the book contained serious information presented in a fun way. He continued, there are no books out there on this subject in a format that is not judgmental. I want to help people make smart decisions. Affairs are wrong, but the reality is that people are having them anyway. So you have to meet people where they are. For a lot of people, morality doesn't end up in the equation. If you are going about your business in a discreet way and you are continuing to take care of your wife and, most importantly, your children, there is no reason to feel guilt. That bears no resemblance to what Scripture says, does it? But that is the idea being put forth by some. And we see that the practice in our own nation, as well as other nations of the world, in many places, is immorality. It's not a new thing. It has existed for centuries, for thousands of years for that matter, and it continues. I'm not going to read you all of the specific regulations on who you can marry. Basically, it is saying you can't marry your family members. It is prohibiting incest. Then we have, in verse 21, what seems to be a little turn away from sexual matters. It says, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. There's more detail given about this in Leviticus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5. There's the penalty stated there. But child sacrifice and cult prostitution were the two most degenerate practices in Canaanite worship. And notice they were a part of worship. Children would in some way be offered as sacrifices to the various idols. I think there is a parallel that we see in our nation's current attitude toward abortion. Now, at this point in time, most people would be in horror if you said, well, you know, if you have a baby born, like our baby just born yesterday, got that in there, didn't I? If you have a brand new baby, and you know, in a few days you realize that baby's defective. Or you realize, you know, I already got 3 kids. That's all I can handle. I'm just going to kill this baby. Now that was done in the first century, done in other centuries. Most in our day would, they would recoil in horror at the very thought of that. On the other hand, there are some people that are fairly good people in a lot of ways, intelligent people, who do not see a problem with putting the baby in the womb to death. Texas has just passed a restrictive law. It's getting a whole lot of negative attention. I think it's a good law. In 1973, the Supreme Court handed down the Roe v. Wade decision. And you know, I think in a lot of ways it's the modern equivalent of ancient child sacrifice. Now, you don't have to take my word for that. Hear instead from someone who views it from a pro-abortion position. The following is a quote from a 1984 Science magazine article entitled Infanticide by Barbara Burke. She writes, among some animals then, infant killing appears to be a natural practice. Could it be natural for humans too? A trait inherited from our primate ancestors? Problem right there. When we hear that some mother has killed her own baby, we are horrified and assume she must be deranged. Some killers, of course, are sick. But human infanticide is too widespread historically and geographically to be explained away just as a pathology or a peculiarity of some aberrant culture. Charles Darwin noted in The Descent of Man that infanticide has been probably the most important of all checks on population growth throughout most of human history. Israel was told, you don't offer your children to Molech. In other words, give them as a sacrifice. Millions of babies, not fetuses, not masses of tissue, millions of babies have been put to death legally. But it is still sin. Verse 22, do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman, that is detestable. In a few short decades, we have gone from marriage is for a man and a woman to marriage is for anybody who wants to be married to anybody, basically. Same-sex marriage is now recognized in all states. It is recognized in a great number of countries around the world. Some still prohibit it. It is sin. It is described as sin in both the Old Testament and New Testament. Verse 23, do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. Now one would think, why do we even have to bring that up? Debbie and I have been listening, or got through listening to some material on Leviticus, and the point was well made. Well, you know, if God gave a command against something, that indicates that somebody was doing it. And so he needed to say, don't do that. It has been a practice for centuries. As awful as it sounds. And while we think, well, surely that's, nobody would go along with that. Let us remember that at one time, the majority of people were against fornication, that is, sexual relations outside of the marriage union. They were opposed to adultery. They were opposed to homosexuality. But those walls have shattered. Basically, there are those who think anything you want to do, anything you can imagine, go ahead and do. Along with this, I think contributing to the problems in our nation and around the world are pornography. Used to be hard to get to. It isn't anymore. It's widely available. In December of 2000, the National Coalition to Protect Children and Families surveyed 5 Christian college campuses to see how the next generation of believers was faring with regard to sexual purity. 48% of males admitted to current porn use, and 68% of males said they intentionally viewed a sexually explicit site at the school. A 1996 Promise Keepers survey conducted at one of their stadium events revealed that over 50% of the men in attendance had been involved with pornography within 1 week of attending the event. A CNN article by Jason Ravu, dated April 6, 2007, stated that 70% of Christians admitted to struggling with pornography in their daily lives. It's there, it's easily accessible, and it's very damaging. Steve Waters, in Focus on the Family, an article in Focus on the Family, said, the fantasy world of pornography is like a big carnival pulling guys in every day with promises of great thrills, only to place them on a lonely roller coaster of excitement and emptiness, arousal and anxiety. No, Israel did not have pornography as such to deal with, although it does go way back in a sense. If you look at some of the ancient artwork that has survived, the artwork that has idols, images of idols, some of it is very X-rated. Well, God says, here's some things you don't do. Here's the rules. And then he speaks of the results. Back in verse 5 he says, you're to keep my decrees and laws, for the man who obeys them will live by them. I'm the Lord. If you follow these commands, you will live by them. There's life. But notice what happens if there is the failure to obey. Verses 24 through 28. He says, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and aliens living among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. God says, if you don't obey my laws, this promised land that I'm giving you will basically expel you. David Roper said, for Israel to become a holy nation, to begin to become a holy nation, deviant sexual behavior had to be labeled as wrong. Once the people understood what constituted acceptable sexual behavior and determined to follow the statutes found in this chapter, laws relating to other aspects of life could be given. It's a very basic thing. How are marriages going to operate? That affects how families operate. That affects how society operates. Under the new covenant, there are also instructions on morality. We need to remember that Christianity began in a world filled with immorality. Christians were called upon to leave their old way of life for a life of purity. Christians were taught not only to control their behavior, but to control their thinking. J.D. Unwin wrote, any human society is free to choose either to display great energy or to enjoy sexual freedom. The evidence is that they cannot do both for more than one generation. There was talk of a sexual revolution a couple of decades back. Sometimes when you have a revolution, you lose. Someone said a house built on sand will not last. Neither will a civilization built on dirt. Civilizations built on immorality will not survive.